She's given a rare interview about her life with Prince Charles and how she has learned to cope with criticism after decades in the spotlight. Maggie really is in London with the story.
For years, the royal family wore unity like a mask. But inside palace walls, a different story had been brewing, one of rivalry, resentment, and quiet humiliation. And when that mask finally slipped, it wasn't a scandal, it was war. To the outside world, the House of Windsor projected a flawless portrait. Carefully timed photo ops, synchronized smiles, and orchestrated appearances that masked the tension pulsing beneath. But those closest to the inner circle knew that not all was as it seemed, especially between Queen Camilla and the woman poised to become the next queen consort, Catherine, Princess of Wales. What looked like distant civility on camera was, behind closed doors, a cold and calculated detachment. The monarchy's facade depended on this uneasy equilibrium, but cracks had been forming for over a decade, cracks that began with glances, sharpened into whispers, and would ultimately rupture into something irreversible. Camilla, hardened by decades of being cast as the villain in Diana's saga, had clawed her way to public acceptance, one carefully managed engagement at a time. And then came Catherine, polished, graceful, untouched by scandal. A woman whose every movement seemed effortlessly adored by the very public that had once condemned Camilla. It was a contrast that didn't sit well. Those within palace corridors say Camilla never truly embraced Catherine's presence. To her, Catherine's flawless image and commoner background weren't virtues. They were reminders of everything she herself had never been given freely. Love without protest, loyalty without cost, and admiration without time having to heal old wounds. While Catherine stood silent, she was not blind. She heard the whispers about her so-called middle-class manners. She noticed the condescending looks and the patronizing tone, but she chose to say nothing. Instead, she focused on raising her children, supporting William, and building a reputation of quiet dignity. That was her power remaining still while others circled in noise. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Catherine believed in playing the long game, and for years that worked. She avoided confrontation and stayed clear of palace politics, believing, perhaps naively, that respect could be earned through service alone. But respect, as it turned out, wasn't enough, not for someone like Camilla, who had spent her life fighting against public hatred and internal rejection. The bitterness grew. It was fed by the public's undying affection for Catherine, and by the subtle sidelining Camilla began to feel within the royal institution she had once fought to enter. Soon, veiled insults became habitual. Remarks about Catherine's family, her supposed obsession with image, her grace being just an act, all of it formed a toxic undercurrent that ran quietly beneath royal functions. Insiders would later say the tension had become unbearable. One recalled Camilla sarcastically praising Catherine's camera-ready smile. Another mentioned how she scoffed at the Middleton family business as tacky nonsense. But still, Catherine remained unshaken. Her silence was not weakness. It was the quiet armor of someone who knew her role would outlast the noise. She didn't retaliate. She didn't leak stories. She waited. Yet even the strongest composure has limits. And the day that masks shattered, it wasn't during a grand ceremony or public scandal. It was during a simple royal planning meeting. A moment so routine, no one expected it to change the monarchy forever. But the real storm began during what was meant to be just another routine royal meeting, until one brutal remark changed everything forever. The walls of Clarence House had seen many arguments, but this one, they'd never forget. A single sentence about Diana shattered decades of restraint. It was supposed to be another scheduled meeting, another routine strategy session to coordinate the public engagements of the royal family. King Charles presided at the head of the long table, flanked by his queen on one side, and William and Catherine on the other. Advisors buzzed in and out with papers, calendars, and updates, completely unaware that within minutes, everything would fall apart. Tensions were already high. Years of quiet animosity had taken their toll, and this gathering brought it all to a boiling point. The moment the topic shifted to an upcoming joint appearance between Charles, Camilla, and the Wales family, the atmosphere began to shift. What was meant to be mundane planning suddenly turned personal. Camilla leaned in slightly, her voice as casual as it was cutting. "Do we really need Catherine there?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Sometimes she has a tendency to make everything about herself. The room froze. Aides exchanged glances, but stayed silent, knowing full well that any reaction could be dangerous. Catherine, stunned by the jab, composed herself before calmly asking for clarification. But Camilla wasn't done. As reports of a private altercation between Queen Camilla and Princess Catherine began to surface, the reaction from the public was immediate and merciless. Social media ignited like dry tinder, catching fire with hashtags that told a story all their own. Number stand with Kate, number not my queen, number protect Catherine. Within minutes, digital armies of supporters rallied behind the Princess of Wales, transforming what had been a deeply personal wound into a national reckoning. It was no longer just a conflict inside royal halls, it was a crisis of public faith, and the people had spoken louder than the monarchy ever could. One tweet, piercing in its simplicity, spread like wildfire. First they tried to break Diana. Now they're doing it to Kate. We see it. We remember. We choose the future. It was shared over 100,000 times and served as the emotional bridge between two eras of heartbreak. Diana's ghost was alive again, this time wrapped in the quiet pain of her son's wife. The people hadn't forgotten the past, and they refused to let it repeat. Camilla, once tolerated for the sake of peace, now stood at the center of a storm she couldn't control. Her silence, intended to be dignified, was instead perceived as guilt. Media outlets scrambled to catch up with the shifting tides. Editorials that had long remained neutral began rewriting their narrative. Headlines once careful in tone now turned cold and sharp. Camilla's influence crumbling, they read. Wales family rises as queen consort fades. In the court of public opinion, Catherine had emerged not as a victim, but as a beacon of resilience. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her dignity became her loudest statement. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Camilla withdrew from her scheduled events, citing health and schedule adjustments, Catherine was everywhere, smiling at hospitals, launching mental health initiatives, and showing up not as a figurehead but as a leader. Polls told the same story. A flash survey by a leading news organization found that nearly 90% of the public supported William's decision to distance his family from Camilla. And in a stunning reversal of fortune, even more close to 95% ranked Catherine as the most trusted and admired royal figure, second only to the memory of Queen Elizabeth herself. It was more than a popularity contest. It was a symbolic coronation, a collective acknowledgement that the future of the crown now rested on new shoulders. But beneath the celebrations, another storm was brewing, one far less visible, but infinitely more destructive, because while the world rallied behind Catherine, King Charles faced a nightmare far more personal than political, and it was tearing him apart from within. For a man who waited a lifetime to wear the crown, nothing could prepare Charles for the cost of watching his kingdom and his family begin to fracture. When news of the confrontation first reached him in its rawest form, his wife humiliated, his son furious, and his daughter-in-law in tears, Charles believed it was a misunderstanding, a flash of emotion, a poorly chosen phrase, something that time and diplomacy could quietly smooth over. He had seen scandals come and go. He had weathered storms that threatened the institution itself. But what he couldn't yet see, that he refused to accept, was that this wasn't a palace squabble. This was personal. This was a wound that no protocol or press release could heal. Still, he reached for peace the only way he knew how, with words. He summoned William to speak in private, hoping that father and son could find common ground beneath the weight of history and duty. But what he found was a man unmoved. William was no longer the quiet, obliging heir. He was a husband first, a son still grieving, and a future monarch whose patience had reached its limit. Charles pleaded for unity for the sake of the family, for the sake of the crown, but William stood firm. "She disrespected my wife. She disrespected my mother," he said, his voice measured and final. There was no room for compromise. The rift had grown too wide. Charles turned to Catherine, hoping her gentle nature would bridge the divide. But even she, known for grace under fire, was unmoving. She listened, nodded politely, but her message was unmistakably clear. There would be no reconciliation. What Camilla had done could not be undone. Back at Clarence's house, Camilla erupted. She accused Charles of betrayal, of choosing William's family over her. She compared Catherine to Diana once more, not out of grief, but out of bitterness. In her eyes, history was repeating itself, and she was again being cast as the villain in a story she thought she had rewritten. Her words were sharp, her fury unchecked, and Charles, trapped between loyalty and legacy, could do nothing but absorb the weight of it all. The man who had once defied a nation to be with Camilla now found himself suffocating in the silence of his own making. He began withdrawing from public life, not drastically, but noticeably. The warmth drained from his public appearances. The dinners he once hosted with ease were cancelled without explanation. His trusted aides described him as distracted, curt, and emotionally distant. A man unmoored. He wasn't just losing control of the narrative, he was watching the future slip through his fingers, and that realization stung most of all. Because for all his planning, for all the battles he had fought to secure his place beside Camilla, the survival of the monarchy no longer hinged on him. It rested on William and Catherine, on their unity, on their approval, on their image. And Charles, the king, had become a bystander in a crown he had only just begun to wear. And as Charles grappled with power slipping through his hands, Camilla was beginning to see her carefully built reputation crumble faster than anyone imagined. She fought for decades to be seen as queen, but in a matter of days, Camilla was more alone than ever. And the silence said everything. Camilla had survived scandal, ridicule, and national disdain. She had endured years as the most vilified woman in Britain, only to rise quietly, step by step, to the title of Queen Consort. But the fall, when it came, was unlike anything she had prepared for. It didn't arrive with screaming headlines or public disgrace. It came silently, through cancelled appearances, revised schedules, and the unmistakable sound of doors closing behind her. After the clash with Catherine, she began to vanish not dramatically, but strategically. Public events were suddenly rescheduled. Her name, once featured prominently on royal programs, began to disappear from the lineup. The explanation was vague: schedule conflicts, health fatigue, routine adjustments. But everyone in the palace and outside it knew the truth. Camilla was no longer needed, and that absence didn't go unnoticed. Once feared for her moods and quietly respected for her influence, Camilla now found herself on the outside looking in. Palace staff who had once tread lightly around her, fearing her icy glares or clipped responses, now moved with quiet defiance. Their allegiance had shifted. The Wales household, once politely separate from her sphere, was now the nucleus of the monarchy's future. Camilla, the woman who had fought to be included, had become irrelevant. Even worse, she had become a liability. The media, too, sensed the shift in power. Talk shows, documentaries, and podcasts began resurfacing the past Camilla had tried so hard to bury. Diana's legacy re-emerged, not as history, but as a haunting comparison. Clips of Diana's tenderness played beside stories of Camilla's coldness. Editorials, once cautious, began drawing stark contrasts between the woman who had won hearts and the one who had merely inherited a crown. For every public step Catherine took, visiting charities, comforting children, launching mental health initiatives, Camilla's retreat became more conspicuous. It was a contrast too sharp to ignore, and the public, sensing the imbalance, doubled down in their support for Catherine. In public, Camilla still stood beside Charles, but that image had become ceremonial, a gesture rather than a connection. Behind the scenes, she was increasingly isolated. Her opinions were no longer sought in planning meetings. Her presence was no longer required at strategy sessions. The monarchy had decided, quietly but decisively, to move on without her. The woman who once commanded influence through silence now found herself silenced entirely. This wasn't a dignified withdrawal. It was a forced retreat. Not exile by name, but by relevance. And the most devastating part? She knew it. Camilla had always been the survivor, the strategist, the one who understood timing. But no strategy could undo what had been set in motion. Her collapse didn't come with a bang, it came with absence, with voices that no longer asked for her, with glances that moved past her, with a legacy that was no longer here to shape. And while Camilla faded from view, Catherine's star rose not by spectacle, but by grace, and the people saw in her something they hadn't seen in decades. She never raised her voice, never took revenge, and yet she emerged from the storm stronger than ever. A future queen not in name, but in spirit. In the aftermath of the confrontation that shook the monarchy, Catherine did not retaliate. She did not correct the record or fan the flames. Instead, she did what she had always done. With composure that seemed almost unbreakable, she walked into children's hospitals, comforted grieving families, and launched new initiatives for mental health and youth welfare. Cameras followed her, of course, but she never performed for them. Her presence wasn't about spectacle, it was about duty. And that quiet commitment, so often overlooked in a world that rewards loud gestures, became her greatest weapon. While Camilla withdrew into silence, Catherine leaned into the people, and the people leaned back. It wasn't just admiration anymore, it was reverence. Every step she took was watched, not through the lens of protocol, but through the hearts of millions who now saw her as something greater than a royal consort. She was the embodiment of grace under pressure, the woman who had been mocked, slighted, and tested, and never once wavered. Royal aides, once cautious in their assessments, began to speak of her with a new kind of certainty. In whispers, they called her the stabilizing force, a presence that didn't just balance the chaos, but absorbed it. And those whispers weren't just confined to the walls of the palace, they echoed in public squares, in online forums, and across headlines. The phrase, "If Catherine had been queen already, this never would have happened," began circulating among royal watchers and insiders alike. It was no longer just a compliment, it was a verdict. The people had drawn a line between tradition and transformation, and Catherine stood firmly on the side of the future. Crowds began to swell wherever she went. Chants of, "We love you, Catherine," erupted at public events, louder and more frequent with each appearance. No matter how scripted the occasion, her impact felt unscripted, sincere. She didn't demand loyalty, it was freely given. And in the minds of many, she had become the rightful heir, not only to Queen Elizabeth's legacy, but to Diana's as well. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. Both women beloved, both women admired, both women enduring unspoken battles behind palace walls. But where Diana was hunted and broken, Catherine stood resilient, an evolved echo of everything the people had cherished. Her silence had spoken louder than any interview ever could. Her poise had dismantled years of palace games, and in doing so, she redefined what it meant to be royal. She didn't just survive the scandal, she surpassed it. She became the uncontested heart of the monarchy. But this wasn't just a battle of personalities. It was a reckoning for the monarchy itself, and the lines drawn would not be undone. This was not abdication. This was not a scandal. This was a silent reordering of power, orchestrated not by the king but by the crown's future. Without uttering a single word to the press, Prince William had reshaped the monarchy. He didn't need a formal decree or a coronation. His authority didn't come from a crown resting on his head. It came from the trust of the people and the strength of his convictions. When he made the decision to sever ties between his family and Camilla, it wasn't symbolic, it was structural. Quietly but definitively, he redrew the lines of power in a family obsessed with tradition. Camilla hadn't been stripped of her title, but she had been stripped of her role. Her influence, once carefully built over years of public rehabilitation, vanished overnight, not through disgrace, but through erasure. Inside the palace, the machinery of royalty began shifting without protest. Event coordinators started reassigning engagements. Private secretaries altered calendars to keep Camilla and the Wales family apart. Jubilee appearances were reimagined without her presence. Press aides were instructed to downplay her coverage. Invitations were revised, seating charts redrawn, all of it done without fanfare, without explanation, but with unmistakable intent. The message was clear. The future had arrived, and it no longer included her. Charles, caught in the eye of the storm, had no choice but to adapt. His attempts to mediate had failed. His pleas for unity had been ignored. And so he did what monarchs have done for centuries when confronted by the inevitable. He yielded without admitting defeat. His public silence, once interpreted as poise, now felt like resignation. The man who had fought so hard to legitimize his reign now found himself irrelevant in the most critical decision shaping its future. He continued to appear with Camilla in public, but the sparkle was gone. The warmth had faded. The people no longer looked to him for strength. They looked at his son. William and Catherine stepped into the vacuum not with declarations, but with presence. Their engagements became more prominent. Their causes received more attention. The monarchy, once ruled by lineage, was now ruled by perception. And perception was firmly in their favor. They didn't ask for power. It was handed to them by a nation hungry for stability, dignity, and direction. This wasn't the formal transition of a throne. It was a revolution of sentiment. Camilla, for all her years of effort, had lost more than just favor. She had lost relevance. Her seat at the table of the future had been pulled out from under her. And the institution she once helped hold together now continued without her input, without her presence, without her weight. What once would have caused public uproar now passed with collective approval. The new monarchy had chosen its leaders, and they weren't Charles and Camilla. They were William and Catherine, and as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer just about family. It was about the survival of the institution itself. She was called too ordinary, too common. But in the end, it was Catherine's silence, not Camilla's scheming, that rewrote the royal legacy forever. In a monarchy, long ruled by lineage, something had quietly shifted. It wasn't the bloodline that secured the future anymore. It was the bond of trust, the weight of restraint, and the dignity of silent strength. Catherine, once viewed as a polished but passive figure, had become something far greater. She had shown that true power did not demand attention. It commanded respect. Without retaliation, without scandal, and without stepping out of line, she reshaped how the crown is perceived and who the people now follow. Where titles once held meaning, now it was character that carried the throne forward. And in that new order, Catherine stood unshaken. William's decision to exile Camilla from their orbit wasn't just about family, it was a message, a declaration that in this new era, some offenses are unforgivable, and some principles must be defended at any cost. His actions were not rooted in rebellion, but in resolve. In protecting his wife, in defending his mother's memory, and in guarding the future his children would inherit, William drew a line that even the monarchy could not erase. He did what kings often failed to do. He chose legacy over loyalty. And the world took note. Camilla's descent wasn't loud, but it was final. She had risen through controversy, endured public scorn, and clawed her way to the title she once thought unreachable. But ambition, left unchecked, turned her victories into vulnerabilities. Her downfall came not because she lost her place beside Charles, but because she lost her place among the people. In a monarchy dependent on perception, she became the shadow behind a rising sun, the past clinging to a future that had already moved on. And no amount of tradition could mask the truth: she had been removed, not by decree, but by rejection. Charles, the monarch who had long fought for Camilla's acceptance, now leads beside a woman no longer accepted. His silence, once protective, now speaks of regret. He remains a symbol of continuity, but no longer of direction. His era, long in the making, arrived only to be eclipsed by the very generation he helped prepare. And while he stands on the throne, the power has already passed to those who carry the crown in spirit. Catherine, once an outsider, now reigns in the hearts of a nation, not through command, but through quiet consistency, not through dominance, but through unwavering composure. She has become the emotional anchor of the monarchy, the living legacy of Diana, and the standard against which future queens will be measured. She did not ask for this role, but she earned it, not with noise, but with grace. The war for the future of the crown is over, and it wasn't won through confrontation, but through conviction. The throne may still be Charles's, but the monarchy, in every meaningful way, now belongs to William and Catherine. Because in a kingdom built on image, sometimes the sharpest weapon is simply choosing not to forget. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.